Welcome to another episode of New Worker Radio presented by the Communist Workers Platform, bringing you national and international news from a worker's perspective. You can find more news and updates like this in our national newspaper, New Worker, at newworker.us. And you can find New Worker on Patreon, where every subscription helps us bring you more news like this. If you're outraged over high costs of living, soaring rents, and the stress of navigating day-to-day life, consider the CWP USA to fight for a real change. To learn more and sign up, go to cwpusa.org. And now, onto our program.
In this episode, we take a closer look at the escalating conflict in Iran, joined by guest speaker Nathan Richardson. We break down the failed negotiations between the United States and Iran, the consequences that followed, including the launch of a U.S. naval blockade. Here in the U.S., we turn to national developments, where Comrade Antek shares insights from an interview with a TSA worker, shedding light on conditions behind the scenes, and we cover the historic strike by meatpacking workers in Colorado, the first of its kind in over 40 years.
These days, the headlines pouring out of Iran have working Americans glued to their screens, torn between outrage and a growing sense of confusion. Airstrikes lighting up the night sky, gas prices climbing again, and a fragile ceasefire patched together on the 7th of April after weeks of American and Israeli attacks, targeted killings, and Iranian counterstrikes. Politicians in Washington keep repeating the same lines about protecting freedom and neutralizing weapons programs. Plenty of ordinary listeners find themselves nodding along, convinced that this time the United States might finally be taking on a genuine threat. The Iranian regime itself hands them plenty of reasons to feel that way. It operates as a theocratic capitalist machine, crushing labor strikes with arrests and violence, locking up organizers, and letting a tight circle of mullahs and Revolutionary Guard figures pile up fortunes, while ordinary families scrape by amid hunger and collapsing services. Even so, this latest wave of military action has nothing to do with freeing ordinary Iranians or delivering justice. It simply recycles the well-worn script of imperialism wrapped in lofty moral language. Months into the fight, it erupted in late February. Everyday life for Iranians has grown no harder. Sanctions stretching back decades had already shattered wages, closed factories, and left hospitals without medicine. Refinery workers in Abadan and teachers in cities across the country keep pouring into the streets to protest poverty and repression, even while foreign bombs shake the ground beneath them. Where is the relief they were supposedly promised? None of these outcomes arrive by chance. All the talk of human rights and regional stability serves one purpose: to lock down oil routes, punish any government that challenges American dominance, and rally public support for conflict without ever touching the roots of the suffering. American imperialism exacts a toll on workers no matter where they live. The identical capitalist forces pushing these wars overseas are the same ones hiking rents and groceries here at home, diverting public money into endless military budgets instead of building the programs people actually need. Working people in Tehran, Detroit, and every corner of the globe share the same urgent requirements: steady employment, decent housing, real health care, and an end to the threat of war. Imperial campaigns and local bosses alike will never supply those things. Genuine change can only emerge through international working-class solidarity, standing firmly against U.S. aggression, while backing the independent fight Iranian workers wage against their own ruling elite. That remains the sole road ahead. Keep questioning, keep fighting, comrades.
The talks between the United States and Iran in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad, which lasted over 20 hours, ended without a result. The negotiations took place against the backdrop of an already fragile ceasefire and highlight once again the ongoing tensions in the region. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance confirmed after his departure for Washington that no agreement had been reached. At the same time, he sharpened his tone toward Tehran. The failure of the talk was, quote, bad news, he continued, adding, "And I think for Iran, this is much worse news than for the United States of America. So we are returning to the U.S. without having reached an agreement." Washington had presented the, quote, last and best offer during the negotiations. We recall that Trump, toying with escalation and leaving many left to wonder whether nuclear weapons would be used against Iran, has openly threatened to destroy key civilian infrastructure in Iran, including power plants and bridges, if Tehran did not open the Strait of Hormuz. He announced he would, quote, blow up everything and take the oil if an agreement was not reached quickly. At the same time, he suggested a possible agreement that has now ended in failure. In any case, the establishment of temporary agreements is a dilemma that is becoming increasingly common in the current phase of escalating imperialist contradictions, where negotiating rhetoric takes place under the immediate pressure of military threats. The Iranian nuclear program was the central focus of U.S. demands. The U.S. required binding assurances that Iran would neither develop nuclear weapons nor create the technical prerequisites for doing so. Other key points of contention, however, were barely addressed by the U.S., particularly the new situation in the strategically crucial Strait of Hormuz. Reports indicate that the U.S. insisted on two key demands, which were rejected by the Iranian delegation. These two demands are, first, the transfer of enriched uranium and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz without recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the territory. The situation in Lebanon is also being speculated as a further point of contention in the talks. Parallel to the negotiations, the U.S. military stated that two destroyers had been dispatched to the Strait of Hormuz for preparatory operations to support potential mine clearance. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard rejected this account and announced that it would take harsh action against any warship attempting to cross the strait. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman sharply criticized the U.S. position. Washington must, quote, abandon its excessive and unacceptable demands. The success of diplomatic efforts depends on the, quote, seriousness and goodwill of the other side, as well as on the recognition of Iran's legitimate rights and interests. At the same time, Tehran emphasizes that it was clear from the outset that an agreement could not be reached in a single round of talks. Iran intends to continue using diplomatic channels and expanding its regional contacts, including with Pakistan. High-level talks between the United States and Iran have been rare since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. These were the first direct negotiations between the two sides since 2015, when the International Nuclear Agreement was signed in Vienna. This agreement was intended to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear bomb. However, the U.S. withdrew from the agreement in 2018, thereby also withdrawing from diplomatic negotiations on the matter. As the current peace negotiations drew to a close, an appeal for de-escalation came from Islamabad. That is, the Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar called on both sides to adhere to the two-week ceasefire. However, he did note that its fragility had been obvious from the outset. Right off the heels of the failed negotiations, the United States has now formally initiated a naval blockade of Iran. Media reported on April 12th that the U.S. Central Command announced that the blockade would begin on April 13th at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time and would include all shipping to and from Iranian ports. At the same time, it was clarified that ships that only pass through the Strait of Hormuz to or from other countries will not be formally blocked. On April 13th, new media reports followed confirming that Donald Trump had ordered the blockade after failed talks in Islamabad, and that the U.S. had simultaneously warned that Iranian boats approaching the blockade zone could be eliminated. Several NATO countries, including Britain and France, refused to join the blockade, while the EU openly stated that free navigation in Hormuz was of crucial importance. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy arteries of world capitalism. About a fifth of the world's oil and gas flows before the war passed through it, and the blockade risks strangling around 2 million barrels of Iranian oil per day. The same reports already describe severe disruption to shipping, stranded tankers, and growing concerns about new shocks to the energy and food markets. At the same time, the UN is working on special solutions to at least get fertilizer shipments through, as the shortage is already threatening agriculture in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This development confirms once again what communists have long said, that the struggle of the imperialist great powers for markets, transport routes, raw materials, and strategic spheres of influence takes precedence and shapes the world, not struggles between democracy and dictatorship, between good and evil states. The U.S. aggression against Iran must be understood in this context, but also in the light of the growing rivalry with China, whose economic center of gravity and trade routes increasingly challenges U.S. global dominance. As the contradictions between the great powers sharpen, entire regions are drawn into conflicts that do not serve the people, but the monopolies and their states. This competition is increasingly shaping developments in the Middle East, and simultaneously complicating any lasting diplomatic solution to the conflict between Washington and Tehran. This does not mean that all sides are equal in every respect, but it does mean that no imperialist power deserves the political support of the working class. What we see is capitalism's own logic in concentrated form. A system built on competition, expansion, and profit-seeking inevitably produces crises, blockades, threats of war, genocide, and open military confrontations. Now we turn to national news, where, in recent labor news, 3,800 meatpacking workers of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, UFCW, an AFL-CIO affiliated labor union for food and commercial workers, went on strike in Greeley, Colorado at the JBS USA food processing plant. JBS is the largest beef processing company in the world, and the Greeley location is their flagship plant in the United States. Workers from the UFCW locals around the world gathered in Colorado to support their Local 7 in Greeley. Beginning on March 16th, the strike lasted 3 weeks, and workers returned to their shifts on April 7th. But they returned to the plant empty-handed, with nothing gained from their resilience. As of July 2025, the contract between the UFCW Local 7 and the Greeley processing plant expired. Negotiations between JBS and the UFCW leadership stalled, and no deal was reached. For all this time, conditions at the plant have only gotten more dangerous, degrading, and exhausting. The decision to end the recent strike was made by the leadership of the UFCW Local 7, including the president of Local 7, Kim Cordova. JBS stated that they are offering the same package as in the previous negotiations and maintain that their final offer will not change. Cordova alleges the return of the previous unacceptable offer is a win, even when she also admits that no negotiations were scheduled during the strike and warned that negotiations may yet again fail. Meanwhile, the rank-and-file workers of Local 7 are left confused and disappointed, while Cordova and union leadership avoid responsibility for demanding that workers break the strike without a ratified contract. The company's offer does not cover the rising costs and living, and it does not address the worsening safety concerns in the plant. These meatpacking workers perform some of the most difficult and dangerous jobs in the country. They work with hazardous materials, heavy machinery, conveyor belts, and a variety of cutlery. The workers who struck at the JBS plant in Greeley bear scars from cuts, chemical burns, and various other injuries acquired on the job. For many, they accept the hazards of the job, but in the plant, the unnecessary risks far outweigh the consideration for safety. JBS often charges workers $1,100 or more to offset the cost of personal protective equipment, which is essential for worker safety. Workers also report that JBS has been increasing the speed of the production line while cutting hours and reducing staffing. As stated by one striker, quote, "They want the same output, but fewer hours and fewer people." To add insult to injury, there is currently a class action lawsuit against JBS filed by 1,000 Haitian workers who allege that JBS recruited them en masse under false pretenses and have subjected them to especially dangerous conditions. The lawsuit includes records of JBS falsifying safety training records for these workers when they could not understand the instructions given to them. Then, they were scheduled on mostly late shifts while the production lines were speeding up to dangerous speeds. At the same time, JBS was forcing these workers to live in one-bedroom motel rooms filled with about a dozen workers each. All workers deserve justice, and these workers of the UFCW Local 7 stood with each other across race and nationalities. Tragically, they're still denied a voice in their union. As one spokesperson stated, quote, "Our team members want stability. They want to support their families, and they deserve the opportunity to vote on the company's historic offer, an opportunity the union leadership has denied them." We, the communists, understand the concessionary nature of union leadership such as this. It is a defining feature of the establishment yellow union strategy. Nothing has changed inside the Greeley plant, but the workers are demanding answers. The Communist Workers Platform of the United States stands with these workers and their fight for justice. These recent events are further evidence of the fact that the establishment unions affiliated with the United States State Department through the AFL-CIO and their leadership are determined to keep workers down, diffuse their frustrations, and force them into compromise. We must forge the path forward by elevating the economic and political demands of these actions and reinforcing them with the strategic and uncompromising efforts to root out the system of exploitation at its source.
Lastly, we spoke with a TSA worker to gain insights from their perspective amidst the latest federal funding shutdown. For a second time in 6 months, tens of thousands of federal workers are being forced to work for free while the theatrics of out-of-touch politicians and union leaders play out in the daily news. At a time when costs of everyday life have risen to a crushing burden, the U.S. government expects workers to patiently wait for wages while continuing to provide their labor to keep the system moving. At Chicago's O'Hare Airport, TSA employees described the latest funding shutdown as wholly confusing, enraging, and stressful. The stated reasons for the lapse in funding is tied to congressional feuds over funding packages for the Department of Homeland Security, namely the funds supporting shock troop ICE operations. The issue here is ICE has already been funded for several years in advance within the Big Beautiful Bill. For TSA workers who do not see themselves as ICE or their duties as being comparable whatsoever, the shutdown makes, quote, no sense and contributes significantly to a growing discontent. Working for one of the nation's busiest travel hubs isn't easy on the mind and body, even when the paychecks arrive on time. Add the absence of stable incomes, the stress of performing the job compounds with figuring out how to survive day by day. A recent executive order issued by the Trump administration aimed to bring workers some relief by releasing overdue pay, but those checks, quote, barely cover money already spent due to months of mounting debts, soaring rents, and paying oppressive prices for food and gas. Over the past few months, TSA workers have increased call-offs and utilized extended sick time, leading to strains on airport security and cancellations of thousands of flights. For the workers, this approach is twofold, freeing themselves up to seek much-needed income through gig work and to flex their labor power. The workers intimately understand and frequently discuss amongst themselves that they have the ability to make the system hurt and demand more by withholding their labor. This growing militancy amongst the workforce goes beyond the demands of labor leaders charged with protecting their interests. Labor leaders of the American Federation of Government Employees, representing some 800,000 federal workers, have limited their approach to seeking concessions from Congress on the issue of lost pay. In a statement issued April 6th, the union demanded Congress to, quote, come back to Washington and do their job to secure DHS funding. In response to this statement, as one worker put it, quote, I do not feel supported by the union in this current situation. What's the point of having an absent union to send dues to? This is in stark contrast to the workers' own understanding and desire to wield their labor power. The union simply wants a return to business as usual, and this lays bare their alliance with the bosses and a complete aversion to anything that would upset capital markets. The growing militancy among the struggling TSA workers is significant and evolving beyond the demands made by their union representation. This displays for us how capitalism lays bare its inability to provide for our standards of living and reveals the nature of those who are in alliance with it. This militancy among struggling workers must be developed, organized, and led with the goal of ending capitalism as its North Star, because to end capitalism is to end our continued exploitation, our mistreatment in the workplace, and the coercion to work a lifetime of wage labor for bare survival.